Thank you very much. What I want to do is provide a historical overview of how we got here, focusing mainly on the U.S., but that will sort of set the stage for all the other sessions that we'll see today and tomorrow. So it'll be a little bit broad, but it'll provide sort of an overview. Before we talk about how we got here, where are we? We talk about the absence of a bipartisan consensus. Well, actually, we have a bipartisan consensus on trade. This is what I call the Trump-Biden trade policy, because there's a lot of continuity here. Tariffs on imported steel, tariffs maintained on China, no more trade agreements, Trans-Pacific Partnership is out, hostile to the WTO, and now we have industrial policy under the Biden administration. A little bit of a shift from the Trump administration, but they're moving in that direction. So that's sort of where we are. How did we get this consensus? Is it really something new? Is it something we haven't seen before? So let's start back with the beginning, and I'm going to talk a little bit drawing on my book, Clashing Over Commerce, which is a history of U.S. trade policy. As you can see, it's not exactly a beach read, but this actually is the abridged version because the editor said that it's way too much. And it talks about the history, Peter talked yesterday about having a TikTok version of his talk. Given this, I wanted to do a Muppet version because there's so many interesting historical figures that have shaped U.S. trade policy over time. Senator Robert Byrd in the early 2000s introduced something called the Byrd Amendment, which drastically changed U.S. trade policy in terms of who got the duties from anti-dumping tariffs. And I thought he could be played by Sam the Eagle in this Muppet version. But there are a few others that I'll come to as we go along. So here's the history of U.S. trade policy in one slide. This is the average tariff on imports. This is the tax that we impose on imported goods. And as you can see, there are a lot of fluctuations over time. It goes back to 1790 because the second act passed by Congress was a tariff act because the federal government needed revenue to pay for its debts. So it goes up and down. The blue line, notice in the middle there, is sort of flat around 45, 50% or so. A pretty high average tariff on imports. There's a little spike there, and then it comes crashing down in the 1940s and early 1950s to a very low level where it's been for some time. Now, we think the Trump administration was some big, new, novel thing. Well, that's the Trump administration at the end there. That's that blip up. So is that historically new or something? And it's certainly new in terms of recent history, but in terms of the history, overall history, we've sort of seen something like this before. So how would I characterize this? You know, there's a lot of fluctuations, there's a lot of changes, but also a lot of continuity, a lot of stability in the system. So I thought maybe my book should have been called Continuity with Change. But I couldn't do that because that was Selina Meyer in Veeps. That was her campaign slogan, Continuity with Change. And of course, the reason is because that's absolutely vacuous. Continuity with change, trying to appeal to both sides, those that want change, but those that want things to stay the same. But actually, that's not such a bad slogan because Malcolm Turnbull in Australia won re-election based on continuity and change. So he actually adopted that as his campaign slogan. So it may work. Okay, what explains this continuity? What explains the changes? This is a map you've probably seen from high school textbooks. I remember in high school, I thought this was incredibly boring. Okay, we know Iowa produces corn. We know that there's the Rust Belt in Pennsylvania, what have you. And all these different places where things are produced. But now I find it utterly fascinating because this explains trade politics. It's largely regional politics in many ways. And politicians know from Tip O'Neill, where you stand depends on where you sit. So it doesn't matter whether you're a Republican or a Democrat in Pennsylvania. You want to help the steel industry. It doesn't matter whether you're a Republican or a Democrat up in Seattle. That's where Boeing is. That's where Microsoft is. You're outward looking. You want openness. It doesn't matter if you're a Republican or a Democrat from Florida. You want to help the sugar industry. Marco Rubio, senator from Florida, pre-Trump was very much in favor of free trade, except for one commodity, sugar. And now he just recently introduced the Defending a Domestic Orange Juice Production Act. It's now a national security issue. We might be losing our domestic supply of orange juice. And so we need to help out the orange grove producers in Florida. This is an age-old tale. And it goes back to an illustrious Dartmouth graduate from the class of 1801, Daniel Webster. Graduate from Dartmouth, became a senator from the state of Massachusetts. Think about Massachusetts back then. What was the big city? Boston. What is Boston? It's a port. So he wanted free trade. He gave these impassioned speeches on the Senate floor in favor of free trade. 10 years later, he's giving impassioned speeches on the floor of the Senate in favor of high tariffs, protecting industry. What's going on? Did he forget his Dartmouth education? Did he relearn things? No. the interests of the state of Massachusetts changed. There's Lowell, there's Lawrence. The textile industry grew up, his constituent base changed, he changed his position. This happens all the time. And so in the 19th century, this is the way political cartoonists viewed the tariff. It's corporate welfare. All these different industries want protection from foreign competition. Who's standing behind the senators? Well, it's the steel beam trust, the copper trust. If you were a progressive in the 19th and early 20th century, if you were Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders, you were a free trader because you didn't like the corporations. They were screwing the American consumer. It was lining the pockets of big business. And you wanted to get rid of this corporate welfare in the form of higher tariffs. And into the 20th century. So this is a cartoon from the 1920s. Once again, every sort of member of Congress sort of representing their constituent interests in terms of who's producing in their district. Here's where this stability comes in. This is a picture on the left of House voting on the tariff of 1828. And the right, it's a picture of the House voting on the tariff of 1929, the Smoot-Hawley tariff. This is a century apart. The entire country's changed. We've gone from rural to industry, agriculture to industry. We've had mass immigration. We have radios now. The whole economy's changed. But what's the pattern? In the North, that's where a lot of industry is. They want high tariffs. They're voting for the tariffs. In the South, they're producing cotton and export crops. They want free trade. 100 years later, it's basically the same pattern, correlation of 0.9 in terms of the voting, not much change. That's that continuity. And I'll come back to that again, the North-South divide in terms of trade policy. But there's a breaking point here in 1929 with that tariff. That was the last tariff actually passed by Congress in 1929, 1930, the Smoot-Hawley tariff. This is Willis Hawley and Reed Smoot responsible for passing this legislation. That spike right there around 1930, that's the Smoot-Hawley tariff, pushing those tariffs on the blue line on dutiable imports up to 60%. That's high even compared to the tariff of abominations, which went above 60% way back earlier. That was a pretty high tariff. But notice the year, 1930, not exactly a propitious time to raise tariffs. Because what happened? Well, first of all, I brought my own copy of the Smoot-Hawley tariff. This is it. And I'd love to do a dramatic reading at lunch. But we're already sleepy after lunch, and this is pretty boring stuff, because it's page after page, paragraph after paragraph, tariffs on individual commodities. It took a year and a half to get through Congress because they're debating the steel tariff, the sugar tariff, the paper towel tariff, all sorts of things like that. The economists didn't exactly like it. They signed over 1,000 economists. 1929-30 signed a petition saying, not a good piece of legislation. It's not going to save jobs. It's not going to help the economy. It's going to lead to foreign retaliation. A contraction of trade might hurt the economy. Economists don't forecast very well, get a lot of things wrong, but they were right on this one. And what we saw was a downward spiral of world trade as we entered the Great Depression, as other countries retaliated against US exports. So there's a lesson there. There's a reason why that was the last tariff act passed by Congress. Congress basically said, we didn't do too well here. We're going to pass this to the executive branch. Maybe they can deal with trade policy better. Oh, by the way, in the Muppet version, Statler and Waldorf will be Smoot-Hawley. Still working on the script. Don't hold your breath for when this appears. Things change after World War II. What do we remember from the 1930s? Protectionism, isolationism, fascism, deterioration of the world economy and the whole world political system. That's why under President Roosevelt and President Truman after the war, we said we need a new world arrangement to create greater prosperity so people are not drawn to fascism. We need to increase trade and get away from the Smoot-Hawley tariffs. President Truman says this, much of the world has concentrated its thoughts and energy on the attaining objectives of peace and freedom. We fought World War I. We thought that was the war to end all wars. We fought World War II. We didn't want to fight World War III. We wanted to bind Europe together in the European community so they wouldn't fight. These objectives are bound up completely with a third objective, the reestablishment of world trade. In fact, the three, peace, freedom, and world trade, are inseparable. The grave lessons of the past have proved it. And that's why we thought we could achieve world peace through trade. We'll see that the world environment is very different today, but that was the hope after World War II. And here's a political cartoon from Herb Bloch. Does anyone remember Herb Bloch from the Washington Post? This is a cartoon from the late 1940s. There's trade freedom on the bottom. And it's holding up political cooperation. And that's holding up world peace. What could interfere with this? Well, the tariff lobbies offstage shooting peas at trade freedom, trying to interfere with that. So we're trying to bring the world together to trade with one another so we don't have these political conflicts, but there are interest groups that don't want to see that. That was the whole mentality of US politics after World War II. And so what we got is during the Cold War, a bipartisan consensus on trade. Trade is good. We want more trade. We want trade agreements, such as the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. We want to bind the Western alliance together. We want France and Germany to integrate their economies so they don't fight a fourth war. And that's where we were for many years. Here's how this changed trade politics. So this is House voting on tariff bills and trade agreements. And you can see there's just a split. As we go up on that scale, you're voting for lower tariffs, for trade agreements. You want freer trade. If you're down low, but near zero, you don't want free trade, you want high tariffs. Republicans, they were the protectionist party. Democrats, they were the progressives, the free trade party. And there's no consensus whatsoever. So whoever controlled Congress, they could get their bill through. That's where we were 19th century into the early 20th century, Smoot-Hawley. Then what do we see? Oh, the Republicans begin to change. They begin to get on board. They shed their isolationism. And they join, and there's this period between 1950 and 1990 when the two parties are in sync with one another. They're voting the same way on trade bills. It's not a partisan issue so much anymore. But the Cold War ends, of course. And what did we do after the end of the Cold War? Well, we continued on this path. We reached free trade agreements, NAFTA, created the WTO. But it's a little bit more controversial now because we're not fighting the Cold War. We're not willing to sacrifice some domestic economic issues in terms of achieving foreign policy objectives. And geopolitics becomes less of a rationale for these trade agreements. Before we had said, we got to keep NATO together, we got to keep the Western alliance together. Now it turns back to, well, are you going to win or lose from these trade agreements or not? And that's why we see after 1990 or so, the blue line, the Democrats, they become the party of, they don't like trade agreements, they don't want lower tariffs, and they move down. The parties switch places. The Republicans become the freer trade party. The parties switched positions. Why did they do that? Some sort of ideological rethinking of where we were? No, go back to that picture. Which region of the country did the Democrats represent in the 19th century, early 20th century? The South. Where were the Republicans? They were in the North. And what's happened is the parties have switched geographic regions that they draw on their basis of support, not that they had some real thinking going on in terms of ideology. And that's where we are today in some sense. And I'll stop back with, and I'll get to the USMCA in a moment. There is a bipartisan consensus there. We didn't want to scrap NAFTA. So both parties were in favor of that. But think about it, too. This applies at the presidential level. In fact, here's President Bill Clinton, a Democrat. Wait, I just showed you Democrats were against trade. Well, he's a Southern Democrat. Barack Obama was a Northern Democrat. Donald Trump, a Northern Republican. George W. Bush, from Texas, a Southern Republican. Where you come from, the regions matter a lot. Jimmy Carter, Southern Democrat, pro-free trade. So the regions really, really matter here. So Bill Clinton signs NAFTA, and that sort of reintroduces sort of trade politics again as a partisan issue. And we've had a series of shocks over time, too, during this period of when the U.S. opened up. The first shock, many of you might remember, not the students, but the Japan shock. A lot of protectionism, a lot of anti-Japanese attitudes in the U.S. That's because imports from Japan ramped up. Then they eased off quite substantially. We had Mexico. So we have NAFTA. Our imports come in from Mexico. There's a little bit of a backlash, not too much, and those are sort of flattened out as well. The big one that we'll hear about a little bit later on from David Otter, the China shock. Okay, another economy coming along, imports shares of U.S. GDP really ramp up between, say, 1990 and 2010 and outstrip some of those others. And then it's tailed off quite a bit. And if Japan, the future of China, if China has debt problems, demographically they're shrinking, I'd expect to see this decline as well. But that's for the future. But these sort of rattled the political system in terms of, do we want to maintain this system of openness? And so now we have what is not so much somewhat a partisan divide, but it's more new political divide of open versus closed. There are a lot of pro-free trade Democrats still, but a lot of Democrats don't like trade agreements. Republican side, they're also sort of split. The Trumps versus the old establishment Republicans. So that's the political divide that we have. The most recent agreement that was been sort of subject of controversy was the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the pivot to Asia in the Obama administration, a trade agreement combining some of the countries in the Asia-Pacific. Democrats didn't like that. Even though President Obama sort of reluctantly sort of moved in that direction, this is the Democratic convention. Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, they don't like it. They don't want it. And so that's this controversy. And what's sort of interesting is that when we look at public opinion in 2016, right when we're having these anti-TPP, public opinion broke in favor of more openness. So this is a Gallup poll just on, do you think openness and trade for the US is an opportunity or is it a threat? 1990s, opportunity. Might say during the China shock periods, mid-2000s, more people viewed it as a threat. But by 2016, we're back to thinking trade's an opportunity. But we're going to reject TPP. President Trump did a great thing for the United States in the sense that we became much more pro. We began to appreciate trade when he started clamping down on it. And we reached 79% in 2020 thinking trade is an opportunity, not a threat to the US. But President Trump was elected, as I said, Northern Republican, very much going against the grain of traditional Republican views on trade. This was his agenda: reduce the trade deficit, stop TPP, pull out of NAFTA, impose tariffs on autos and steel to create jobs, decouple with China, stop the WTO. Quite an extensive list. So what did he do? Well, here's his tweets. This is how he communicates. Trans-Pacific Partnership will increase trade deficits, send more jobs overseas. Bad deal. Don't want to do that. And of course, that was the Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren position too. So you got a coming together here in some sense. So day 3 of the administration, signs of executive order, we're out of the TPP. Interestingly, his vice president, Mike Pence, also a Republican, he had tweeted before he joined the team, oh, TPP, that means security. That means the pivot to Asia. That means containing China. That means increasing our alliances in the Asia Pacific. We need to adopt the TPP. Of course, as vice president, he couldn't take that position. Interestingly, too, Republican senators write a letter to President Trump saying, you know what, that decision about TPP, we support you, Mr. President, but that may not have been the best decision because we actually export from our districts. We'd like you to reconsider going into TPP. TPP is not exactly dead. I think there's always going to be this sense that that's an opportunity, particularly if we're concerned about China in the Asia-Pacific region. Maybe we ought to go back in. So pull out of TPP, what about NAFTA? That's next. $60 billion trade deficit, one-sided deal, worst trade deal ever made. So we got to pull out of it. I remember the week, as some of the journalists might, when there was a rumor leaked in like Monday or Tuesday that the president was going to go to Pennsylvania on Friday and announce we're out of NAFTA. And that sent alarm bells off in Mexico City and in Ottawa and U.S. Producer interests. Everyone started scrambling. And interestingly, it was the Secretary of Agriculture that brought into the Oval Office a chart very similar to this that convinced the president not to pull out of NAFTA. And the chart explanation was like this: Mr. President, you won the Midwest. Those are states that export to Mexico. You're going to be hurting your own voters, your own constituents, if you pull out of NAFTA. You can't do that. The states that voted for Hillary, they don't export to Mexico. So they're not going to be affected. Don't hurt your own constituents. So he backed off and said, we'll renegotiate it. So here's some of the farmers. Farmers for free trade. They benefit from NAFTA. His constituents in the Midwest. So, okay, said we're going to renegotiate it. Here's where you just have to probe, how much, is there continuity or is there change? This is what the USTR, the U.S. Trade Representative said, these are our negotiating positions. What do we want? First of all, President Trump said it's a bad deal. We have a trade deficit. So number one, improve the U.S. trade balance and reduce the trade deficit. That's the first objective of NAFTA, renegotiation. The problem is trade agreements have nothing to do with trade balances. Trade agreements set the rules on trade, but the flows, those are determined by many other things. Capital flows, commercial considerations, what have you. So NAFTA has nothing to do with trade balance. And in fact, in the first place, the negative trade balance with Mexico, it's trivial compared to with other countries. So the trade balance, that's just not really what's going on. Okay, if it's a really bad deal, what's the second objective? Here's the giveaway. Maintain existing reciprocal duty-free access. So this is an unfair trade agreement, and your second objective is to maintain the status quo. So what's the problem with NAFTA? In fact, it just goes down. Agricultural goods, maintain existing. Well, you don't need a new agreement to maintain the existing status quo. So we signed USMCA because NAFTA is a bad word. That's some people call it USMCA. US-Mexico-Canada agreement. It's not even trade, it's just an agreement. Most important trade deal in history. The terrible NAFTA will be soon gone. USMCA will be fantastic for all. So what's new in the USMCA? Well, it tightens some rules of origin. We won't get into that term in terms of autos. And that's about it. Then we throw in a whole bunch of new provisions on digital trade and e-commerce because this was NAFTA was a pre-internet agreement. Where do we get those agreements from? Oh, TPP. So what is USMCA? It's NAFTA plus TPP. So Justin Amash from Michigan, a member of the House, calls this out. NAFTA, worst trade deal ever made. TPP, even worse than NAFTA. What is USMCA? It's NAFTA with elements of TPP, the best and most important trade deal ever made. That's what the president said. So that's where the continuity is. There are tremendous pressures not to really rip up the North American economic relationship between the US, Mexico, and Canada. Here's another way of putting it. President Trump overturns trade. That's Robert Lighthizer, US trade rep, and the Canadian minister for trade. And then he declares victory. They just go back to where we were in the first place. Here's the reaction of many people in Canada and many economists. It's not terrible. You know, we thought it was just going to rip up the North American relationship, but that's sort of where we are. But President Trump, deep in his heart, believed trade is bad. This is his own writing, own handwriting, coming back from a summit, reproduced in Bob Woodward's book. And so why? Well, because not everyone has benefited from trade. We have to help those left behind. And who have been hurt the most? Auto workers, steel workers, all manufacturing. We got to help them out by imposing tariffs. And he said, I'm a tariff man. We're going to not allow other countries to raid our great wealth. We're going to make America rich again. And in particular, we need a steel industry. So we got to help out the steel workers. If you don't have steel, you don't have a country. So now here's where the laws come in. You just can't impose tariffs by fiat. You have to go through a process. He vents in the Oval Office, I want tariffs, bring me some tariffs. And so we impose tariffs on imported steel. Is that a good thing? Is that going to help out the steel workers? Maybe a bit. But people worried about, well, what about the other effects? Wilbur Ross, the Secretary of Commerce, goes on national TV and says, look, no one's going to feel these steel tariffs. You know, it's going to increase the cost of a Campbell's soup can by $0.01 cent. No one's going to notice, but it's going to help out these workers. Okay, well, what if you make this? This is made in Indiana. This is Caterpillar. What if you're Boeing? Do you use a lot of steel and aluminum in producing aircraft? What if you're Ford or GM? Do you buy a lot of steel? Yes. And if you have to pay a premium of 20 to 25% over your competitors in terms of your imported inputs, that's going to hurt your cost position. You're going to lose jobs. And so Ford, GM had to pay a lot more. And this affected college students all around the United States because it priced out of the market domestic producers of kegs. And we may have lost our keg industry by raising those tariffs on the intermediate goods. And I've had many heart-to-heart conversations with Dartmouth students about this very issue. Although actually Dartmouth has banned kegs a long time ago, and so now we have on Sunday morning we wake up and there's just beer cans in these trash all over the place. Anyway, so that's those tariffs. What about China? China, does it play fair? Should we retaliate against them? Well, trade wars are good and easy to win. Do you remember that slogan? Okay, so we're going to fight back against China. Well, what does China do? Oh, we don't have to buy Boeing aircraft. We can buy Airbus. Oh, we don't have to buy American soybeans. We can buy Argentine soybeans. They retaliate, and U.S. exports fall more than 1 for 1, almost with those tariffs being imposed. There's backlash. What do we have to do to the farmers? The farmers are always the first to get hit when there's foreign retaliation against U.S. tariffs. So what do we have to do? We have to compensate them. We have to subsidize them. So there's something supposedly you won't hear from a Trump farmer. Yes, actually, they took the money. It was $12 billion. I think it went up to $20 billion in extra farm subsidies to compensate farmers for lost sales in international markets because of the retaliation against U.S. tariffs. How about making America rich again? Here's what the Congressional Budget Office said. Tariffs are expected to reduce the level of real GDP by 0.5% and raise consumer prices. Tariffs are projected to reduce average real household income by $1,300. Is that making America rich again? Is that adding to the prosperity? And of course, people went out on the streets to protest the tariffs. Do you remember this from the New York Times? Actually, I'm not sure the New York Times covered it. The One America March, protesting tariffs, stop the tariffs. Well, that's because only a dozen people went. It was sort of this non-event. No one gets excited about protesting these tariffs. Of course, we saw the Democratic Convention against TPP. So where are we? Public opinion, still relatively pro-trade. Another Pew poll. Americans generally positive about trade agreements, critical of tariff increases. We've seen sort of what happens when we impose these tariffs. New tariffs take hold, more see negative than positive impacts. Either as consumers or as industries that have to pay these tariffs and will move the jobs overseas to avoid paying those tariffs on the intermediate goods. But what hasn't changed and what has become increasing is we don't like China. China's not a friend. They don't share our values. They may not play by the rules. That's not just the US, where we have moved increasingly against China. It's Japan on the left. They don't like China. It's South Korea on the right. They see China unfavorably. So we are in a new geopolitics of trade. It's not so much based on, we're not going to bring back the jobs from China. When we imposed those tariffs on China, we just started importing more from Vietnam. But it wasn't done to protect the domestic industry. The China shock happened. We can't bring those jobs back. It's to distance ourselves from China and for national security reasons as well in certain sectors. So what has President Biden done? Maintained these tariffs, relabeled it a bit. We have a worker-centric trade policy. That's meaningless. Which workers? Are we talking about the steel workers or the Boeing workers? Are we talking about textile workers or are we talking about farmers who depend on foreign sales? We forget sometimes there are a lot of jobs behind those exports. And when we impose import tariffs, we get retaliation that hurts those jobs. We have something called the IPEF. Okay, no TPP, but there's the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework to re-engage with the Pacific. It's a nothing burger because there's nothing on the table because we're not going to make any concessions. We're going to tell countries in the Indo-Pacific region what they ought to do to sort of help us out, but we're not offering any concessions, so that's going nowhere. But of course, the new thing is we have learned a lesson. Tariffs don't work very well in bringing back jobs. And if we want to make a green energy transition, if we want to reshore the semiconductor industry, tariffs won't do it, subsidies might. And so we're going in for industrial policy. But the twist is, at least with green energy, is there's a Buy America provision, which is a bit protectionist and has gotten Europe and other regions upset because they think they're going to be excluded. And I just urge you to look at Peter Coy's piece in the New York Times a couple days ago on Don't Buy Biden's Buy America. That provision is a subject of controversy. So where are we? If we just look back at the history, trade has always been a source of domestic political conflict. There are certain groups and industries and regions that are going to be adversely affected by imports, but there are a lot of jobs behind exports, and consumers are industries too. Consumers are industries too, not just households. There's a strong status quo bias in the system. It's really hard to have big changes. Really hard to get legislation through Congress, really hard to shift the direction of US trade policy, as we saw with President Trump thinking he could just withdraw from NAFTA. Protectionism is a terrible jobs policy. It doesn't work. We have to rethink what our labor market policies will be. Just closing borders, that's not the route to prosperity. But we are in the new era. We have a bipartisan consensus. We may have a new Cold War. Economic security may dominate in terms of future discussions. Last slide. We know that trade conflicts will always be with us because that's the theme of Star Wars. What's the whole premise behind Star Wars? It's a trade dispute. So we've had them since 1790. We'll have them in the future. Thank you very much.
Professor Irwin, as you know, you review the data and the charts about tariffs up, tariffs down. What are your thoughts about a different kind of overlay? Because you've also thought about this too. You referenced it in the presentation. You can imagine just thinking about the entire subject in a different way in terms of how much we are going to be helping workers adjust to the disruptions of tariffs up or down, and how much we're not, because that also has historical progressions. But as we mentioned last night, we're never that good at adjusting for helping people adjust, are we?
Not really. In fact, when you look back at the history, Congress would just pass these tariff acts and they'd take effect the next day. So the tariffs go up, the tariffs go down. There's no adjustment, no phase-in. In the post-war period, what we've done is, let's say with NAFTA or the GATT, is we phase these in over time. So there's a lot of consultation that takes place, and we just allow sort of the market to work itself out and phase in things over 10 years, so there's not an immediate shock to the system. But even if tariffs are flat, as we saw with those import surges, Japan, we didn't change our tariffs against Japan, but Japan was growing rapidly. They became very good at producing automobiles. We didn't have a policy in place to help out the auto industry or the auto workers, just left to their own devices.
Left to their own devices. You did see the email address, right? camcon2023@gmail.com to get your remote questions to us. What about here in the House? Questions to Dr. Irwin, other than the fact that he's a walking advertisement for why you want to pay for a Dartmouth education.
Well, we talked about attention spans, and I teach it early in the morning, so you gotta wake people up.
Anybody can teach cool humanities courses, but try teaching trade, and you see how it's done. Questions here? Because I have many others. There's one here in the we're going to start back here with volunteer number 2. Tell us your name.
Yes, good morning. My name is Stefano Tijerina, and I'm a professor at the University of Maine. I'm very curious. You mentioned pressures that don't allow the status quo to change. But I didn't really hear you talk a lot about these pressures. I would like you to talk about how the private sector was able to transition the country from a tariff world to a zero tariff world in the 1980s, and how difficult that was. Even though you say it's difficult to go back to nationalism and protectionism, it must have been hard to move from a protectionist market to a very free trade market, which we live in today.
Well, we have to think about policy versus what's going on in the world. So if we went back to that tariff chart, the tariffs actually came down in the 1940s. So by 1950, we already had pretty low tariffs. We were a pretty open market, but we didn't face any import competition. Europe was trying to recover from World War II. Japan was a very poor country, also trying to recover from the war. So the tariffs came down, but the imports didn't come in. And that sort of made it easier for politicians to vote for free trade agreements because there's no consequence. Now, once they're low, however, you have Western Europe coming back, you have Japan, and then later other countries in Southeast Asia, obviously China more recently, and there's an open market that's an opportunity for them too. But as they're growing, of course, we're exporting to them as well. It's a two-way street. So that's why there's this de-link in some sense from policies can change, but the trade flows may not. And then the trade flows will change for other reasons, depending on what policies you have in place. Which also explains, I think, a little bit why we don't have the labor market policies in place, is because in the past, sometimes we'd reduce the tariffs and the imports weren't coming in. But that was a different world.
A different world. There's a question, I think, in the center.
Thank you for your very energetic speech this morning.
You had a good question last night, but remind me your name.
Vera Trojan. I'm from Belmont, Massachusetts. Could we go back to the topic that China might not be playing fair? And this is something that many businesses echo, that sentiment, and increasingly so. So do the benefits of free trade accrue as enthusiastically as many feel when you're dealing with different economic systems that are trading with each other?
That's a great question. That's a great intro to Mark Wu, who will be speaking shortly on exactly that topic. So I'll defer. He'll get into it a lot more. But that, I think, is the fundamental problem. You know, we can reach trade agreements with China that affect border barriers, tariffs, government procurement, even some non-tariff barriers. But the fundamental problem is their system is very different than ours. And it operates not through these tariffs, but through subsidies. And the subsidies are not explicit. They're often hidden in the banking system, where you get credit, You don't have to pay it back. The terms change. Japan, there was a little bit of an issue with Japan too. The problem wasn't so much direct tariffs or subsidies as the fact that the Keiretsu had access to the banking system. So that's a fundamentally different way of organizing your economy. And the problem for the US is that if they have a bad sector that's not earning money, they don't let it die. They prop it up with subsidies. Whereas if you have a free market economy, there's bankruptcy. That's an option. So in some sense, their over-subsidization of various industries from shipbuilding to what have you, shipbuilding hasn't affected us, although there's Bath right down the road, that creates adjustment problems for other countries because they don't let up on the subsidies, they keep propping up unprofitable industries and force other countries to reduce their capacity to accommodate them. That's a problem. That's a very difficult thing to get through in terms of trade negotiations, and that's why I think we're going through this reset. But I do think there's a fundamental question about whether having a differently organized economy in the same economic framework, such as the WTO, works. And I think we're seeing it's not working.
By the way, in Japan, just explain Keiretsu. It's a business cartel?
Cartel, or I might say business linkages tied with banks. Yeah. So once again, it's not the trade policies per se, it's the credit system that is sort of a fundamental issue with some of these economies.
I want to ask you, picking up on China, elaborate on the point that you're making that if you extrapolate U.S.-China trade going forward, you saw a decline, and you mentioned debt to GDP ratio, for instance, in China. Why less bullish, besides the trade war that we're having with China right now?
Well, China thinks the U.S. is a declining power. I think China's a declining power because, once again, some of this will play out over long periods of time, some of it could be very short. Fortunately, economists have been predicting a financial crisis or problems in China for some time, but if you look at the buildup of debt and how are they going to deal with that? And it continues to this day. Unproductive real estate, now where demand's declining as the population shrinks. So remember that Japan shock? Early 1980s, it goes way up and then it sort of declines. How's Japan been doing over the past 3 decades? Once again, they had a housing bubble, and they've been sort of flat since then, and not growing very rapidly, declining population, and that's sort of the long-run case for China as well. I mean, one thing with the China shock, it wasn't just they're exporting a lot more. The working-age population was exploding during this period. Now the working-age population over the next 30, 40, 50 years is going to be contracting by more than the population of the United States. So this is going to be another thing that we're going to be, another adjustment that we're going to have to take into account over the next coming decades. But their long-run prospects, I think, both in terms of financial system and in terms of the demographics and the aging, is just, the future is not necessarily with them.
And we'll have other people up on this stage today and tomorrow who can also weigh in on this important issue, but I'll just run it quickly past you, a follow-up, which is, for people who might be in this audience celebrating, oh, cool, Japan's a declining power, it can make a very powerful country cranky and can have national security implications.
Absolutely, yep. And so that's why there's this window of the next 10, 20 years or so where things are going to be tense.
We celebrate the high school students who are also, imagine, on a perfectly good Saturday, engaging world trade when you're in high school. Love it. We have a question from Connor of Edward Little High School in Auburn. Elaborate more, Professor, on the shift to during the Biden presidency affecting trade as we came out of the Trump approach. Not that different, you were saying?
Not that different. Not too much has changed. There hasn't been a lot of rollbacks of some of the measures, as I mentioned, in terms of steel, aluminum, the China tariffs, and what have you. Also, not a lot of engagement with China. So the Trump administration tried through something called a phase 1 deal where we would, if they would open up their market and buy more of our products, that we could scale back the tariffs. That sort of was thrown out the window with COVID, and maybe they couldn't adhere to it in the first place. But what is really new about the Biden administration's approach is industrial subsidies. And once again, targeting semiconductors and green energy and electric vehicles. There's a very interesting article in Politico, an interview with, this came up yesterday with TSMC. Morris Chang, the founder of TSMC, where he was telling Nancy Pelosi, so you think $50 billion is going to shift the semiconductor industry to the US? When construction costs in Ohio are like 3 times what it costs to construct a new facility in Taiwan or in Southeast Asia, and you may not have the skilled labor to man that plant, good luck with that. They said, we'll move because we'll take some of the subsidies, but if you think you're going to uproot the industry and move it to the US, you need commitment and you need the base, the skill base, the construction base, and what have you. And he would seem to be throwing some cold water on that. It's going to be revolutionary. Subsidies I talked a little bit about tariffs. Subsidies are a much better intervention in the market to the extent we have to have them because there's accountability with them. They don't create negative ramifications for downstream industries that have to pay higher input costs. For example, we want the semiconductor industry. We tried tariffs in the late 1980s against Japan. Guess what we managed to do? We had some computer industry, we had some laptop production in the United States, immediately went overseas. Because once again, they can't afford to pay 20, 30, 40% premium on their inputs and compete against Toshiba or other foreign producers of laptops. So anytime you use tariffs, you raise prices, that pushes downstream industries overseas. If you use subsidies, at least you don't have that negative downstream industry effect. They can get the benefit of those lower prices and stay in the US potentially.
You just said it, but we need a base of people with skills to do this. I wouldn't say it's controversial, but it's just amazing that we're sitting here kind of, yeah, that would be a good idea. Isn't that nice? We should at some point sit down and work on that. We are not where we should be on just that issue if we're in such a globalized world.
Partly the problem is trade seems to be an easy fix. We don't like what we're importing, so stop those imports. Instead of thinking about, well, what resources and attributes do they have that's giving them an advantage in certain sectors, and how do we get our act together here in terms of our educational system, in terms of capital formation and things of that sort. But once again, trade is sort of the easy fix.
Questions here in the House?
And it's not a fix.
It's not a fix. There's one in the center. I don't know who can get there quicker. Maybe volunteer 3?
I'm Sally Smith from Montpelier, Vermont. We haven't subsidized many industries until Biden's, but we have subsidized the Pentagon. Would you talk about the relationship of the subsidies that the Pentagon gets and does increasingly get every year, every Congress, and its relationship to arms trade?
Military spending.
Yeah, we're talking in the midst of the U.S. running down its ammunition stock. And I think those subsidies are going to go up, not down in this fragile world that we have. If Russia's an aggressive power and we're worried about China's military threat, we've allowed our Navy to shrink, Pentagon will be there. So you can judge for yourself whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. But I think my last slide, I think, had economic security. It's not about the efficiency so much anymore. It's about resilience. It's about friendshoring, all the things Peter talked about last night. And the Pentagon will be right there. But interestingly, when I talk about the steel tariffs, those were imposed on national security grounds. We need a strong domestic base. Interestingly, who intervened within the Trump administration to oppose steel tariffs? The Department of Defense. Secretary James Mattis wrote a letter to the President and the Secretary of Commerce saying, you know what? The import market share is not exploding here. Most of our imports come from allies and friends, Japan, Korea, Canada. We don't want to offend them with higher tariffs. We're not importing a lot of steel from China and Russia. They've been hit with anti-dumping duties and things of that sort. So there's no national security case for those tariffs. So the Pentagon, was acting a little bit differently than one might think when one sort of invokes national security. Of course, I don't think the Pentagon has weighed in yet on the national security implications of orange juice production, as Marco Rubio suggested, where we need that here at home.
There's a question in the center, I think, too, right next to Sally. A couple people over. Tell us your name, sir.
Thank you. My name is Ryan Schaefer. I'm in South Portland, but I work in Washington, D.C. for a company called the Japan America Society of Washington, D.C. And we spent a lot of time focusing on TPP, among other things. But I'd be curious to know I mean, I think the argument is that there's no path forward for TPP. There's just going to be sort of murmurings and maybe some hope. But at the same time, it seems like in the second half of the first term, of the term of the Biden administration, you could make the argument that there is a pathway forward because the tone in Congress is one of focus on security. That's kind of the buzzword. The House has just shifted, and if Republicans are now the pro-trade party, you could make the case that while Biden is looking for opportunities for bipartisan consensus, that TPP might be one of those ripe opportunities. So help me understand why that's wrong. And I would just put in a plug for our Japanese friends. When Prime Minister Kishida visited recently, he was very pointed in his request and hope that the U.S. return to the table on TPP. Thank you.
Yes, so TPP, first of all, I agree with sort of the premise and I think where you're going. I don't think it is dead. It's sleeping maybe, it's lingering, but I think it's there to be revived at some point in the future. Who knows exactly when? And the reasons are various. First of all, when we pulled out of TPP, we did not end TPP. The TPP partners continued with it because they saw economic integration as a geopolitical strategy, partly against China, but to strengthen their economies. I think there are going to be foreign policy interests and economic interests why, in the long run, we will have to rethink our decision to stay out of TPP. The economic reasons are, if you're a beef farmer from the Midwest or Montana or what have you, all of a sudden it's harder to sell in Japan. Why? Because Australia and Japan have a trade agreement, so Australian beef can get in Japan, but we can't. And that applies to auto parts and so many other things in that region. In other words, by staying out of these agreements, we are discriminated against and we're excluded. And there's commercial opportunities. And then the foreign policy interest, of course, is if we're serious about containing China and strengthening our relationship with Southeast Asian countries and East Asian countries, economic engagement is the way to do that. And I heard the Deputy Prime Minister of Singapore recently say, in the Asia Pacific, trade, that is political engagement. That's the way we do things here. And by standing outside of the system, we're not only foregoing those opportunities, but we're not engaged with the region the way we should be, I think.
A little smaller piece of that question was mentioned the new Congress and the Republican Party being the party of freer trade. How do you actually see it right now? It's pretty complex there in the House.
Yeah, so in terms of free trade...
No, I'm not going quite there
sorry,
yet.
yeah,
I'm picking up on just this notion of, in broad historical sweeping terms, the Republicans now are the party more of freer trade, but really, the new House Republicans?
Well, so we have someone who can speak on this issue a little bit more from my home state, which I dearly love and voted for Senator Sununu. But the Republicans are split because there's a Trump faction and then there's sort of the old-fashioned faction. And they are going to have to work that out over time, and it will take time. But as those, even like Senator Daines from Montana, big Trump supporter, but not on trade.
Not on trade.
Because once again, you have certain producer interests in your state, and if they see we're foregoing opportunities internationally, you want to grab those. Because as President Obama and so many other presidents have pointed out, 95% of all consumers are outside the U.S. And we have a big internal market. We're the world's largest economy, but there's a lot out there too, and we can't ignore it.
We have a remote question from Jim in Rhode Island. In 2001, he writes, we fought for fair trade agreements as opposed to free trade agreements. Do you, Professor, believe in the idea of fair trade? That's often linking trade, as I understand this, with, for instance, worker rights overseas and environmental concerns and stuff like that.
Who's against fair trade? I mean, but what do you mean by fair trade? So President Trump thought NAFTA was an unfair trade agreement. But everything we did, Mexico did in terms of those tariff levels, bring them to zero. So it was even on both sides. Is that fair or unfair? Well, he didn't like the trade flows, but that's, once again, it's the rules of the game. We have introduced environmental provisions into trade agreements. The big issue coming, however, is carbon border adjustment tax. I hate to use that mouthful, but one of the big looming trade discussions, which I'm not sure any of the panelists will be speaking about, is as Europe, as other countries become more concerned about the environmental effects of trade and production, and we impose taxes domestically on producers that pollute, how do we manage the international adjustment of those at the border? That's a hugely complex, very difficult issue, but the U.S. is going to have to face that in the coming decades. In terms of worker rights, there's sort of big problems, both enforcement, defining these things, ILO conventions. The U.S. has not signed up to a lot of ILO conventions, so the question is, shouldn't we be signing up for some of them as well? And historically, that's been sort of a very difficult point.
International Labor Organization.
International Labor Organization. U.S. labor unions want high labor standards overseas. There's a sad case of Cambodia where they signed up, and the U.S. labor unions agreed that they had signed onto provisions that raised those standards that should have allowed trade to move freely, but once the garment started moving, the unions objected. So fair trade is just a hideously complex issue.
Question over here, volunteer one has. Hi, what's your name?
Hi, I'm Hank Thayer. I'm from Wethersfield, Connecticut. Full disclosure, I work in aerospace, so I got a big personal interest in all of this. But given that we've talked about how broad-based, broad brushstroke tariffs are not good and so forth, we also have certain industries where we want to make sure we maintain a position, potentially maintain a lead, or move into new industries, aerospace, industrial lasers, automation, such like. How do you make the distinction between propping up old industries that may not have a future as opposed to making sure we foster industries that are going to be big growth opportunities in the future?
Some of that may be industrial policy, right?
Exactly. I think what's important is to have an environment that's conducive to the private sector to make those determinations. Because, once again, if we're asking the federal government to identify and then subsidize those things and outperform private capital markets, we get sugar subsidies. We get a lot of agricultural subsidies. Corn, first primary will no longer be going through Iowa, I guess, in terms of the Democrats. That's probably good for U.S. corn policy and sugar policy, because there's a reason why when you go through Iowa and Des Moines, you got to say, yes, I'm in favor of supporting the corn farmers with subsidies. So it's asking a lot of the political process to say, let's have sort of an independent view on what industries are going to be working out well in the future, and subsidizing them. Someone said, governments can't pick winners, but losers can pick governments. Because there's a lot of, you go to Washington, D.C., there are a lot of lobby organizations that are just ready for a ramp up of subsidies with industrial policy.
Is there, we'll first do volunteer 3 with this nice person here, and then we'll go to volunteer 2. Or maybe several in this area.
Ward Wickwire, Lincolnville Beach. Question on, you've talked about two components of industrial policy, subsidies and trade. How about innovation, a la DARPA and the internet, the aerospace program, and the whole semiconductor industry and so on? Is that a proactive part of industrial policy, or is that just by accident?
It's a little bit of both. There's a wonderful book on the semiconductor industry by Chris Miller called Chip Wars, which I highly recommend to the audience. It talks about the evolution of the U.S. semiconductor industry in a global context, and talks about DARPA and the subsidies, and how, once again, we get to the Pentagon, I haven't seen an effective or a good cost-benefit analysis of what DARPA has done, Defense Advanced Research subsidies, but there have been a lot of industries that have done well, the internet included, as a result of those. How much of that was conscious design versus accidents of history that sort of evolved? It's, when these subsidies start, it's very hard to know where they're going to end up, whether they're going to be a success or not. And that's not necessarily an argument against them. The Obama administration was attacked a lot for Solyndra, the solar. But anytime you try new ventures, some are going to fail. So one or two failures shouldn't compromise the whole idea. But we have to be very careful in terms of how we structure these things, and to make sure that we just don't add to the continued deficits we're having in terms of fiscal policy.
And if you're taking notes, the reference the professor just made was to the book Chip Wars. That's the Tufts professor, right?
Exactly, Chris Miller, yeah.
Chris Miller, okay. Just want to make sure people got that. There was yet another question right here in the front, then we'll go to volunteer two. Tell us your name.
Sarah Miller from Camden. And you haven't related, in a certain sense, the trade policy to decisions over the last 40, 50 years by American corporations to shift the bulk of their manufacturing overseas. And that's one of the accusations, is that trade policy has supported the corporations, but not supported the country, if you will. Could you talk about that relationship between where our corporations make things, what our trade policy is, and how that relates to, by trade policy, I want to incorporate not just tariffs, but trade agreements specifically?
So some of the foreign investment that we've seen companies make is driven by U.S. trade policy. So I think NAFTA, the sharper critics of NAFTA said it's not a trade agreement, it's an investment agreement. And they're somewhat right. It was helping out Mexico in terms of attracting foreign investment, because actually it's in our foreign policy, national security interest to have a rich, prosperous, wealthy Mexico rather than an impoverished crime state. NAFTA was trying to help them move in that direction, and I think it's still incomplete in terms of what we've seen. But a lot of the foreign investment is not as a result of U.S. policy, it's a result of other developing countries opening up and creating a business climate that's receptive to investment, and then U.S. firms find that conducive. So a lot of East Asian countries, not anything that we changed our policy, but they became more open and for their own self-interests and started attracting investment. And the final note I'll make is that, when we think about New England, I'm from New Hampshire, we're here in Maine, we talk about loss of textile jobs and what have you. Who took those jobs first? The South. So there's a lot of manufacturing in the South. And I think that is incumbent upon the states in the North to think about right-to-work laws. What is it that's why if you're a BMW or a Mercedes and you want to, and you are willing to invest in the United States, why do you go to the South and not Ohio or in Indiana? And so states such as New Hampshire, we always have to rethinking. We're in a competitive environment. It's not just jobs leaving the U.S. Jobs are coming to the U.S. in terms of foreign investment, but where are they going? Which states are conducive to that sort of thing?
camcon2023@gmail.com to get your questions remotely to us. Volunteer 2, who do you have?
Someone from UMaine. So the speaker mentioned earlier that the U.S. used to preach world peace through trade. I just wanted to know if it's still the case or things have changed.
The perception has certainly changed. And so, yes, it may have worked in Western Europe, but one of the premises behind opening up with China was that we'll make them a more peaceful commercial state instead of a hostile communist state. And that clearly has not worked. But when we think about strengthening alliances, it's very difficult to have a political alliance with other democracies without having close economic ties. And so I think we can't just say that whole rationale was wrong or irrelevant, but there needs to be some adjustments in thinking as we move forward.
I just got to bow to respect your magnificence for the wonderful pithiness of that amazing question. I mean, that was well done, and should be a model for us all. Question over here.
Hello, thank you. Bill Lorman from Camden. Could you say a few words on how tax policy impacts trade policy?
Well, tax policy is a huge subject in terms of corporate taxes, personal income taxes. Now we're talking about a global minimum tax under Secretary of Treasury Yellen has been negotiating. I'd say the biggest area here is in pharmaceuticals and the shifting of profits to Ireland and tax shelters such as that. That to some extent affects production, but I think it's sort of beyond production in some sense. Because it's not as though Ireland is sort of a tax haven, if you will. So I think that's why the Treasury is sort of looking at how do we restructure taxes. We can't do it by ourselves. We have to do it in concert with other countries to try to eliminate some of these the sheltering of income that Apple and the pharmaceutical industries and others take advantage of.
We have a remote question from Ahmed in Foxcroft Academy. And I'm going to read the question as listed, but also let's just add a little asterisk to it. The question is, what would be the effect to trade if Donald Trump returns to the White House? You could try answering that, speculative. But also, if any other Republican returns to the White House, there's some people being talked about at the moment. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Absolutely. So, Nikki Haley, Southern Republican. What'd I say about the South? Okay, so that's TPP, an opening for TPP. That might be some sort of opening. Donald Trump, here's my worry as a trade economist is I think there's been learning. He's learned the system. So when he first came in, he had a lot of advisors who didn't share his views on trade. So Gary Cohn, head of the National Economic Council. President Trump said, what, this trade agreement we have with Korea, I don't like it. Draft me a memorandum to pull out of the U.S.-Korea trade agreement. It was drafted. Gary Cohn slipped it away from the desk. The president forgot about it, and we never pulled out of that agreement. NAFTA, he was contained by his cabinet and others saying, let's renegotiate it, not pull out of it. I think what he's learned is that not all of his advisors in his first term were with him, and they boxed him in a little bit in terms of trade. In the second term, if he came back, he would know who is loyal and who's willing to do what he wants to do and override the rules, and none of this, the old-style Republicans. And so when he says we want to pull out of the WTO, when we want to pull out of the U.S.-Korea agreement, when we want to pull out of NATO, these things could happen. So I think it would be much more risky in a second term than in a first because he's learned how the system works.
Can we use the Nikki Haley paradigm on anyone who might be coming out of Florida who seeks that position on trade?
Well,
it's another Southern.
I think so, yes. Once again, even NAFTA had carve-outs for fresh vegetables and a bunch of other things to sort of get it through and get it through the Florida delegation. So free trade doesn't mean all sectors and what have you. You have to reach political deals and have certain carve-outs. But in general, I think anyone coming from the South, Republican or Democrat, is going to be much more pro-trade than someone coming from the Rust Belt.
So my goal here is so that in any kind of social setting, you can win on the subject of trade going forward. And I just got to bring you back to one of your points from the presentation that's counterintuitive, but just elaborate a little bit more, Professor. Lots of people walk around thinking that trade agreements would have a major effect on the balance of trade. In fact, I can just see your midterm question. To what extent do trade agreements, why don't they have more of an effect on the balance of trade? Also, when you answer that, explain what balance of trade really means.
Okay. Need a prop.
Yep.
Here's $1.
$1.
I'm a U.S. consumer. I want to buy a good in China. I give them $1. I buy whatever I'm buying from them. They have $1. We now have a $1 trade deficit with China. What are they going to do with this dollar? Can they pay their workers with this? No. Do they want to keep it in China? Doesn't really accomplish anything. If they take this dollar and can send it back to the U.S. and say, we'd like to buy some Boeing aircraft or some soybeans, we'd have balanced trade. Instead, what China says is, I would rip this, but I won't.
Don't.
75 cents of it or 50 cents of it, I want to buy U.S. goods. But the other 50 cents, I want to buy a U.S. asset. We talked about the reserve currency aspect of the U.S., and I think you said it was a great benefit to the United States. I'm not so convinced.
No.
Because what that means is the 50 cents that they want to buy an asset, they want to buy U.S. Treasury security. They want to buy a U.S. company. They'll buy a U.S. asset. So we'll have this merchandise trade deficit, but they're buying they're buying a U.S. asset. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? In some sense, we have a structural trade imbalance because so many countries around the world want to hold this for safekeeping. Now, think about what happened in 2008, 2009 with the financial crisis, which I presume you all remember. What happened to the value of the U.S. dollar against other currencies during that crisis? It went up. We are the only country in the world on the face of the planet that can have a financial crisis and our currency appreciates because it's a safe haven. So yes, it's convenient for us as tourists, in terms of exchanging money or what have you, but I think it can be viewed as a problem for the US because there's this insatiable demand for dollar-denominated assets, and that means they'd rather buy US assets rather than US goods. And then I won't give you the lecture on exchange rates and capital flows, but what's really driving the trade deficit is we are importing capital, like I said, from the rest of the world. And it's the capital flows that are driving the trade flows, not the other way around. So the idea that a trade agreement, which is just affecting these tariffs at the border, are going to affect the net capital flows across countries or this demand for the dollars, it's just not there.
All right. If anybody makes
Let me
that
put it this way.
mistake, yeah.
If you're a country and you have really high tariffs, there's no guarantee of a trade surplus. There's just as many countries with big trade deficits with really high tariffs. So the correlation is just not there.
You should use that last bit on the exam, and you're going to get the A+. Volunteer 3, you want to go wherever? Ma'am, there's one just behind you, and then we'll get to you in just a second. So in the back. Hi.
Hi, I am Nashra, a student at University of Maine from Bangladesh. My question is, Professor, you mentioned South Korea and Japan does not like China because of their culture, but still they're going back to China for importing goods and then probably for the value they're getting, probably for the money. Why is that? What is the reason behind it?
Well, China's economy is incredibly large. It's a huge market. And so even if you don't like those countries, I didn't necessarily say for cultural reasons, it's just there's tensions for political and all sorts of other reasons. The economics of the relationship is just so beneficial to Samsung and other companies and consumers that it's going to be very hard for the politics to override and pull back on that relationship. That's why the Biden administration has a really tough road when we're trying to convince other countries to limit the sale of semiconductors or semiconductor equipment or otherwise sanction Russia or China for various reasons, is because the economic ties are so deep and it's very hard to unwind them. But I will say, you're from Bangladesh. Bangladesh is a huge globalization success story. And I hope you appreciate what's happened to your country over the past 2 decades, because it has opened up to trade. It's benefited enormously. An amazing statistic for many of you in the audience might be that Bangladesh has now reached, if not exceeded, India in terms of per capita income. If you think back to where Bangladesh was 20 or 30 years ago, utterly poor and destitute, and the way they've been able to attract foreign investment in the garment industry and others and promote exports and grow is just absolute triumph.
We're getting close to the close, but I did promise.
Can you really stand up?
Tell us your name.
Jean Matlack, Camden. Would you talk about the protectionist elements in the Inflation Reduction Act?
In terms of the Buy America provisions?
Yes.
Or?
Yes.
So the Buy America, that will not reduce inflation. But, look, I've never been a politician. I don't know what it takes to get legislation through. You have to win votes, and so there are going to be concessions. I don't think it's problematic in terms of foreign economic relations. It's not the end of the world. We can talk about these things and make modifications. And if you need to do that to get votes, that's fine. But I don't think it's a huge deal. It's mildly protectionist, but we've had a lot worse. So.
Follow up real quick. Wait, let's just the mic real quick. And then we're going to go to the break.
I was distressed to learn.
Yep, it's on.
Is it that in order to get the federal credit, if you purchase an electric car under that act, you have to, all the elements in the battery have to come from America.
Yeah, that phases in, right? It's not quite all, but yeah.
Yeah, and there's an issue about do you have to have a free trade agreement with the countries, because we don't with the European Union. That's problematic. I'll leave that to future speakers to talk about. It is problematic, but I'm not sure it's something could be dealt with.
All right. Professor Irwin from Dartmouth. Wonderful, right? Thank you. Thank you.